Thank you so much, everyone. Don't worry about any of the stragglers coming in. I have a couple minutes of intro, so it's not that big of a deal. You know what's funny is I often give talks at conferences, and I don't actually have a lot of my coworkers here, especially the technical people. So I really hope that I get it right, and I didn't just do a whole bunch of gross generalizations. So, yeah, there you go. So my name is Bob Walker. I'm a field CTO at Octopus Deploy. And I'm really excited to be here because I get a chance to give an opinion talk, which is very rare for me. Oftentimes it's doing a case study. But this is an opinion talk of why I think Canary deployments are a myth and that true progressive delivery occurs via OpenFeature. So quick raise of hands. I'm kind of curious, who's using OpenFeature today in production for feature flagging? OK. Who is here interested just learning about some case studies on like how feature flags work, what does it work, or anything along those lines? Just raise your hands. OK, it's about awesome. Almost the exact opposite. I don't know why I asked that question. You might be wondering, does a field CTO do? I am not a CTO. I'm not a manager. I'm not a vice president. I am an individual contributor. So I don't set the technical direction of the company. I don't assign anyone work. But I did reach an important milestone last year where scammers are starting to use me for phishing attacks, which is really smart because I can't get anyone to do anything, but they're asking me to send out scamming emails. All my contact information is up there. That QR code will send you to my LinkedIn page. If you disagree with my opinion, I'd love to know more. I gave a talk similar to this where I basically got up on stage and said, you all need to stop deploying to production every day. Your users can't handle that. And someone came up to me afterwards and said, you know, what your problem is you need to separate the concept of deploying a new version of your code from releasing functionality. And that's kind of what sent me down this path to the talk I'm giving you today. Now, for my technical background, I started off as a developer way back in the early days of .NET. In fact, my very first job was converting classic ASP websites into ASP.NET web applications. Raise your hands. Who in here remembers ASP? Oh, wow, that's a lot more than I was expecting. I started so long ago that Visual Studio didn't even have a year associated with the release. It was just Visual Studio.NET. Since that time, I went through the normal gambit where junior developer, senior developer, lead developer, architect, all that other good stuff. Now my job at Octopus Deploy is talking to customers, helping them with their deployment problems, which kind of gives me on the other side of that. So I've done hundreds and hundreds of deployments as a developer to production. Some good, some bad. The worst was doing the 2 a.m. deployments on Saturday. That was awful. And I've also helped a number of other customers with their deployment strategies. And I've come to the conclusion that we need to address the elephant in the room, which is what is a myth and what's not, which is that implementing Canary deployments is going to solve all your deployment problems, which kind of sounds crazy coming from a person who sells software that does automated deployments, right? But everyone that we talk to, they're like, I want to do Canary deployments. It's like, great. Do you have everything ready to go for Canary deployments? No, we want to buy a tool that'll implement it for us. I'm like, oh, OK. So first thing I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the myth that is Canary deployments. I'm going to break that down. Then I want to talk about appropriate use cases for Canary-style deployments. And then I'm going to spend the most of my time talking about OpenFeature and progressive delivery. And that's going to be more focused in on a case study internally of how we're delivering changes to our customers. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up with some challenges. So first off, let's talk about the myth that is Canary deployments. I always laugh at that. Sorry, I gave my slide deck to our design team, and they started adding in transitions. So the very first time I ran through this after that, I was shocked. Anyway, I diverge. So Canary deployments makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because the whole point of it is you want to roll out a new version of your code. We just heard about talks about adding new features and progressive delivery and everything like that from Dynatrace and the previous gentleman. And the whole idea makes sense. I want to release a new feature. I'm not 100% sure if it's going to work. So if, quote unquote, something goes wrong, I want to be able to revert, especially if I can minimize user impact. But really what you're trying to do is you're trying to get feedback from your users to make sure that nothing goes wrong. And that's really what it is. That's really what a Canary deployment is. It's feedback. If everything starts crashing after you roll something out, that's a form of feedback. That means you definitely need to act on it. But you also might just be getting feedback from your users of, you know what, this feature doesn't really meet my use case. So the logical conclusion for Canary deployments kind of stems from the old days when I was a developer, .NET developer, where I'd have a load balancer. I'd deploy a new version of my software onto a subset of my servers, and then I'd ideally route a percentage of my traffic over there. And now we see that happening today. But with Canary deployments, when you start diving a little bit deeper into the problems, you start seeing these little things pop up. Namely, will a subset of my traffic invoke all my code, all the different possible code paths? Does my, just want to make sure my animation shows up. Yes, does my application host even support Canary-style deployments? Can my application architecture support multiple versions in production? And then finally, indiscriminately routing traffic for brand new functionality can lead to a very, very disjointed user experience. So I'm going to talk about each of those for the next couple minutes or so. And unless you're really a FANG-sized company, having a subset of your users try out new functionality is not going to exercise all your code paths. That's just an unfortunate truth. And we even ran into this within Octopus Deploy. So very, very early days of our SaaS product, because we have a SaaS product as well as a self-hosted product, we were investigating different deployment strategies. And we said, okay, we can't deploy as soon as we have a new version to all of our customers. That's just not working. So let's have more of a Canary-style approach. So let's deploy to our staff users first. And then after a day, we'll deploy to our insiders. And then after 7 days, we'll deploy to our early adopters. And then 7 days after that, we'll go ahead and deploy to all of our stable users. So what that works out to be is 15 days to deploy a completely new version to all of our customers. Even in that lengthened period of time, we were still running into some pretty critical bugs. So clearly something wasn't working as we expected. So now that we've kind of addressed that, let's talk a little bit about application hosts. Now, modern application hosts, AWS Lambdas, Kubernetes, super easy to implement, well, in theory, to implement Canary deployments because they support that out of the box. But even when you look at Kubernetes, out of the box, it doesn't support Canary deployments. You have to use a tool like Argo rollouts. Or you might be using a tool like, say, Azure Web Apps. And they don't have Canary deployments, they have staging slots. And so then you have to build additional infrastructure. And don't get me started on traditional Windows VMs or Linux VMs. But even if your application host supports Canary deployments, unless you have specifically architected it or you've tested it, you're unlikely to support multiple versions in production. I've asked AI to generate a lot of these images in case you're wondering where the crazy town comes from. So I said, generate me an image of OLTP database, and that's what it came up with. So if you have an OLTP database backing your application, there is a very disciplined approach you can take to be able to support multiple versions in production, but it has to be very deliberate. Because that pesky database, it doesn't really like it trying to run 2 versions at the same time. And then let's actually talk about new features and functionality. So when you indiscriminately route traffic, because that's really what Canary deployments are, is I want to route 10% of my traffic to that new version. Imagine a very disjointed user experience, what that would be like. So give you an actual example. In 2024, very start of 2024, this is what Octopus Deploy looked like. By the end of 2024, this is what Octopus Deploy looked like. Now, could you imagine for a second what that user experience would be like, where I would have this, I'd log in, and then I log in the next time and I see that. And then I log in again and I see that. Your users would be pulling their hair out trying to figure out what's going on. And I've given a talk similar to this, and everyone's said to me, hey, this is where Session Affinity can solve this, your sticky sessions. Yeah, you're not wrong in that sense, but at the same time, think about, we live in a world where people have multiple devices. Myself, when I came here to London, I traveled with my iPad, my laptop, I have a Switch, I have my phone. Now, when I log in to my banking website on my iPad, I generally expect it to be the exact same experience as I would on my laptop. Or imagine if you targeted a particular team for new features and new functionality, or a subset of your users. And maybe 2 of the users see the new functionality, but 10 of the users don't. Very confusing, like within the team, because half the users can see one thing but not the other. And then, as we just talked about, some deployments take much, much longer than those 30 minutes to 60 minutes that typically happen with Session Affinity. All right, so let's talk a little bit about appropriate Canary use cases. So there is a place for them. Really what it boils down to be is if you have an application where sessions don't really matter. It's very transactional. Canary deployments can be very, very valuable when you want to indiscriminately route traffic like that. Think of, really, only 5? I thought I had till 25. Okay, I just want to make sure. Think of Google. Google does things very, very transactional. You do a search, you might get a result back, everything along those lines. Or if you're moving or upgrading an application host. So for example, at Octopus, we host everything on Kubernetes. We want to deploy a new version of, Kubernetes just came out. We don't do an in-place upgrade. What we do is we spin up a brand new cluster, and then we move all of our hosts over. Or if your business rules don't change. So what I mean by that is I worked on an application where we wrote everything originally in Oracle packages. Who in here has heard of Oracle packages? I'm just curious. No one raises their hand. Wow, you are all the lucky ones. They are awful. All of our business logic was in there. And I was given the mandate that we had to rewrite everything in .NET. I'll move all that business logic out of that. But the mandate was it had to be the exact same. So if I sent a request through the Oracle packages, and I sent a request to the .NET service, it would be the exact same response. So much so that I actually found bugs, unsurprisingly, in our Oracle packages, and I had to insert shims into my .NET code to replicate that functionality. But because we did a deployment, it worked out really well because we could just route a percentage of our traffic over to the new version of running the .NET service. And because the business rules were the exact same, or the result was the exact same, if there's any problems, we could easily route everyone back. So there is an appropriate use case for Canary deployments, but not new functionality. So I'm going to spend a bit of time explaining how our SaaS product works in terms of architecture, just to provide a bit of extra context. So our SaaS product uses cell-based architecture. That's a really fancy way of saying that every one of our customers, they get a dedicated instance, that means a dedicated copy of our application, dedicated database, dedicated file store. So basically they get their own cell. That's the phrase that we're using. Now, being a deployment tool, I think it's reasonable that most people would expect when they want to deploy to production that the tool will be made available to them. And that's pretty reasonable. However, we need to perform maintenance ourselves. We need to do database backups, just general database maintenance, perform upgrades, any of that other stuff. And so as a compromise, we let our users select when they want that maintenance to occur. And this graph represents all of our instances and the start of their maintenance window. In case you're wondering why everyone starts, or so we have such a big spike at midnight UTC, it's not because everyone works, or all of our instances are in London. That's the default. So this is kind of how it works out, especially with new trials. But as you can see, it can take upwards of 24 hours for us to get a new version pushed out to all of our customers because we have to respect the maintenance window. When we want to release new features and functionality, when we roll it out, it's going to take us 24 hours for us to get a complete version out to all of our customers. And if there's any sort of problems, it's going to occur during that time frame. Well, we want a bit more control over that because we don't want to have multiple versions running in production like that because it can be very confusing. Oh, well, that bug was fixed here, that bug was fixed there. But new features are often the #1 cause of every problem we run into when we go to production. Very rarely does code just stop working unless you change something. Either the infrastructure's changed, a configuration has changed, or the code has changed. So if the code hasn't changed because you haven't messed around with it, then unlikely to stop working. It's the new features and functionality. We also needed to gather feedback before we started releasing functionality to all of our users. And the whole idea with the release rings was we could start gathering feedback sooner, but ultimately that proved to be a false idea. And this is where feature flags really allowed us to benefit from all of this. It allowed us to separate deploying a new version of our code from releasing functionality to our entire user base. And so how it works is we have multiple what we call release rings. In our system, it actually doesn't look like it, but in our minds, it's kind of the mental model that we've put together, where we'll do a deployment for a new feature, and what we'll do is we'll turn everything off for everybody. Because the feature might not be ready yet, it might have some bugs, or whatever the case may be. But it also allows us to verify that, yes, if we have to turn this feature off in the future, that functionality will continue to work. There's that kind of that sensible defaults that we were talking about a little bit earlier. And then we'll turn it on for our staff instances, but not all of our staff instances, only some of them. So for example, my instance, my personal instance, I'm always asking for functionality to be turned on, but our demo instance that we use for our customers when we want to show off, hey, this is how our tool works, well, we need it to look exactly the same as they would get when they're doing their proof of values or their proof of concepts. Then what we'll also do is then we will turn it on for early adopters. And this is when early adopters can start opting in. And so we'll turn on the functionality for their particular instance. And what this allows us to do, which is really cool in my mind, is we actually have, right now we have 4 concurrent early adopter programs running with the list vastly different. So we have new features, I can't list out all the features, but we have a ton of new features coming out that we're gathering feedback on. And what this allows us to do is get a chance to get feedback from them. Does this work as you expect? Does it not work? Is there a use case that we're missing? And so I showed you that new user interface, for example. I was using that, and I was providing feedback to the team and saying, I think we're missing this particular button here. And I had a lot of back and forth, and then it's like, yeah, you're absolutely right. But we're able to get that feedback before we released it to all of our customers, and all of them immediately complained that that button wasn't there. And then after we're done, we start getting all that feedback and everything's working for us, then we can start rolling it out to all of our customers. Now, this is a bit of a misnomer in terms of the graph. We don't really enable it like this very disciplined approach where it's 33%, 66%, and then 100%. Most of the time, I think I was talking to our engineers, it's like 5% for like a week, and then like, screw it, 100%. But for, say, that new user interface that I showed you, we definitely were very careful about that because that was a pretty significant change. So much so that when we released that, the new user interface, one of our customers, or several of our customers, ran into use cases that we hadn't thought about with it. Ran into some issues. Something wasn't working exactly how they expected it to work. And then what we were able to do is we were able to pause it and give us time to evaluate it and say, okay, is this because of a significant issue that we need to fix? Or is this a unique configuration and we need to find another approach? Or is there something else? But it gave us time to evaluate that. And then, if we needed to, we can exclude them and continue on for everybody else. And that was extremely powerful as well. It's that negative use case. Being able to turn it off for a subset of your users while turning it on for everybody else. And that was extremely beneficial for us because that allowed us to get even more and more feedback. And then once we fixed the issues for those subset of users, then we rolled it out to them. So the end result looks like, this is what our user base saw for months. And this is what I saw for months. You might notice, the keen-eyed observer might notice that the dates kind of look really off. That's because when I went back to take a screenshot of the old user interface, I had to find an instance that had that old user interface. I was like, whoa, this is rough. So it's almost jarring in that sense. But it was extremely powerful for us to be able to do that. In case anyone's curious, this is what it kind of looks like for us when we want to set up feature flags. And you can see that we have enabled for a particular environment, and then we can select what instances that it looks like. Excuse me, not what it looks like, but we select what instances we want to roll it out to. And this is what it looks like when we have to turn it off for a handful of instances. As you can see, this particular feature we had to turn off for a lot. I don't envy the person who had to go in and select each of those individual instances. That doesn't look like a lot of fun. But that, again, this is extremely important, being able to have that capability to disable it for a handful of people while enabling it for everybody else. Now, one of the side benefits of this was around how we built code. Now, when I first started at Octopus, there was a feature that we were working on that took over a year to develop. And they were in their own feature branch for that time. And they dutifully merged from main, like you're supposed to, fairly regularly. But then when they decided to merge to main, then that's what it kind of looked like. Now, we leverage trunk-based development. And so what that means is that we have very short-lived feature branches. Rob, what's the average feature branch duration? Like a couple days?
Pretty often, yeah. So maybe a couple of days.
A couple days? Yeah, so a couple of days is about how long a feature branch will live. But the functionality itself can take months to develop. So what we're doing is we're merging in small incremental improvements into our code base. So that is also a big game changer for us because, again, we can start getting that feedback, and then based on the user's feedback, we can then merge that change in, and everyone's running off the same branch, which is main, when we do a deployment. So none of this, oh, we need to cut a whole new version of our application to get feedback from our user base. But I do want to talk a little bit about some remaining challenges that we have, because it's not all sunshines and rainbows. So I mentioned that we have a SaaS product as well as a self-hosted product. The feature toggles that I'm talking about is only available for our SaaS product. Our self-hosted customers, they have their own fun upgrade schedule. Sometimes it might take a couple days for them to upgrade after we release a new version. It might take them several months. And no matter what, we're always going to have a situation where we have self-hosted customers. That's just something that we have to deal with. The other thing is it also requires a very disciplined approach. Saw 1,200 feature flags or feature toggles still existed in one of the previous presentations. And so that happens. You need to adopt this expand and contract pattern where the expansion of your code base is adding the feature toggles, adding the appropriate unit tests, adding whatever else you need to do for it to work. Roll it out, and then after that, you need to have a contraction that needs to occur after a period of time. Now for us, we have a forcing mechanism because we have a self-hosted product that we release about every quarter. So when we release that self-hosted product, that's when we'll go through and remove all the feature toggles because it doesn't work for them. But for anyone who just has a SaaS-only product or it's an internal product, you need to have your own forcing mechanism to go back through and clean that up. So it requires significant investment into your SDLC. That's kind of the TLDR of that. But honestly, so do Canary deployments. And I would make the argument that implementing OpenFeature is significantly easier to implement than trying to implement Canary deployments, trying to deal with different application hosts, trying to figure out how you're going to do database updates, trying to test everything in production. I think with OpenFeature, you can get progressive delivery or 90% of the way there to progressive delivery within about a week after you select something. So thank you very much for your time. I think we got time for maybe one or two questions.
Thank you, Bob. All right, who's got any questions for Bob?
That presentation was that good.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. I'm interested how, when new features are added, that often involves perturbing existing code.
Yeah.
I'm interested how you use features to avoid those perturbations affecting your continual deployments and save them for an open feature. How do you store up those code changes so they're on a different path?
So we put a feature flag. We have that kind of that internal conversation around should we add a feature flag versus should we not add a feature flag to that. And then once we make the determination of adding a feature flag, then what we'll do is we'll add it, and then we're constantly merging into main. So we don't really have like a buildup of feature flag, like of check-ins or commits. And we're always merging all new changes into main at any given point in time. So then we'll just turn on the feature toggle once we're ready to go for that. So again, we never have a situation where we have like a bunch of different branches that are deploying to production. It's just one branch. It's always main, and we're always checking into main constantly. Hopefully that makes sense? Did I answer your question? I hope so.
Yeah, sure. So as you're merging those changes continually, then you're perturbing potentially existing behavior.
Yeah.
But part of the goal of this was to decide when to release those, when to expose your customers to those changes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you fork that code internally and actually have two copies of that code side by side, or do you?
No, we don't have any of that. It's just when we make the decision to enable a feature, it's a pretty big decision. Especially, like, I'm going to use the new user interface as an example. It was almost like a NASA launch, where it's like all systems go. Do we feel confident about what we're about to do? Versus just, okay, let's just turn it on or something like that. So the product managers have to agree. We have to pass a certain barrage of testing and everything along those lines before we just turn it on. But you're absolutely right. But we also dog food internally, where we turn on all these features for our main deploy instance. And that's how we're able to test it and verify it and make sure that everything's, like, we have a modicum of confidence that everything's going to work perfectly. So.
I can add to that as well. So we do testing.
I'll add to that as well. So we do testing that will exercise the different feature toggles. So in our unit test and integration test, where it makes sense, we'll have, like, we've got the frameworks there to toggle it on and off. Obviously, we don't test every single permutation because it doesn't necessarily make sense. So there's a bit of just sort of heuristics and common sense that's involved. But we do generally try to cover tests.
And if this is the answer to your question too, sometimes you can separate, like you want isolation. So sometimes you can isolate at a request layer. Sometimes it might be a fork in the code somewhere that says we're highly confident the old code is still running the way it was. And that's not an open feature situation. That's your architecture that you have to think about there. And it's probably the most challenging part of it. Yep.
Any others? Yep.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. Very interesting. I was just wondering, when you said initially you turn all the feature flags off, how does this reflect in like persistent database changes, for example? I mean, at one point, like there's a new column or so, right? And you cannot just switch it on or off or something like that in a normal way of a database perspective, I think.
Yeah. So this is one of the reasons why our feature toggles are only for our SaaS product, because we have a lot more control over that database layer. So we can control when the database script runs versus not runs. But then also when it comes to the actual database itself, I mean, when I say those feature toggles are turned off and then we turn them on, it's not a multi-day thing. We turn it off, we feel pretty confident, and then we turn it on. I would almost argue by default, our main deploy instance that we use, it's actually turned on for pretty much everything. So we're able to see what that interaction is like. But we also have the capability, because everyone has their own copy, every customer has their own copy, again, we can kind of control it a bit more in that sense.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any others? No?
I think I'm over time.
Thank you, Bob.